All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. First slide, this is pretty cool, right? A Maze and ADPList collaboration. I'm so stoked to be kicking off this partnership between Maze and ADPList. And we're really, really excited to be teaming up together to bring more awareness and skill building around product research. So that actually brings us to my lightning presentation today. Demystifying UX research for creating better products, or in short, UX research for designers. To get it started, I just thought maybe that I would introduce myself so you kind of know the perspective that comes into play with this presentation. So my name's Ash Oliver. I'm a UX designer and the design advocate at Maze. As I was just talking about in the beginning of the chat there, I moved to Amsterdam last year from Seattle, so not much of a change in weather. But the random fun fact here is that I figured I would share something a little bit more personal with you, since this is ADPList and we are a bunch of product people from all over the world. So there's a lot of different backgrounds. I know that many of you may be in different stages of your career. And I thought it might be helpful just to note that my own background takes a very non-traditional path. So I actually came from a growth background, and that very much informs my perspective when it comes to design and therefore this talk. So you'll see a few more nods to these references as we go along. For instance, I've got some really good book references. I always have the good recommendations for books. So if you're so inclined, those will be there afterwards. I think I might have somebody that's off mute just in case. Okay. All right, let's dive right in. So as I mentioned, this is going to be a lightning style presentation, which means that there's going to be a lot of slides and it's going to move pretty swiftly. But as I mentioned, this is going to be recorded, so you can go back and reference it. And hopefully this will just kind of act as more of a topical layer to expose you to product research. Quick caveat, hence the title, this is mainly put together for UX and product designers, but it certainly can apply to those that are either in or interested in specializing in UX research. So first, we're going to cover the design or designer's role. So not just as you as an individual, but also the broader function of design within UX research. Basically, why research is dope and why you should do it. Next, we're going to cover 10 UX research methods. Each one could have its own dedicated presentation, so it's really not meant to be a super deep dive, but more to just give you the horizontal view of what methods are available to you and what kind of insights they uncover. Ultimately, how you're able to use those to be able to drive better product outcomes. We'll also take a quick look at how to choose the best method and what kind of questions you should be aware of when you're looking at utilizing these methods. And then finally, we'll talk about how this actually equips you with leverage. I'll give you some practical advice on how you can actually leverage the results and also doing product research within your role, how you can advocate for doing more of it, and even advocate for it if you're a team of one. So at the very end, we'll open up to a Q&A section, but I hope that this talk leaves you with a better understanding of just the techniques that you can utilize to create better and more user-centric products. All right. And I think pitch might be a little slow for me here. There we go. All right. So the design or designer's role in user research. What really is this? Because in a lot of teams, it might look like an actual specialized user researcher that is doing the user researcher. UX designers may not do a whole lot of user research, or there might be some conditions in place where perhaps you're focused on a particular area within UX design and the opportunities just don't arise very often for you to be able to perform any user research. But ultimately, as designers, we should be thinking about our design ideas as testable design ideas, right? We really need to be able to identify the gap between what we know, or even what our assumptions may have us believing, and what people, our actual users, want, what they do, and where there's an opportunity for a design solution. So being able to have this triangulation between doing your role as a designer, but also being informed by user insights is really, really important. Otherwise, you're really just kind of designing in a vacuum. So research is rigor. It's really the difference between designing for real humans who have a need and just having an opinion. Don't get me wrong, I'm a designer, I have lots of opinions, but this aspect, research, whether you're getting it from your specialist team or you're doing it yourself, is really the key difference in what makes a successful product in design. So I want you to keep in mind that while research typically is thought of as this enormous endeavor and takes a lot of heavy lifting in order to do, research doesn't have to be an enormous thing. And if you are able to do even lean research within your design process or workflow, you're going to be able to generate better, stronger ideas. So if we bought into being able to do research and understand its impact in our designs, why don't we do more of it? Well, today, more modern product teams, they understand that in order to create those experiences that are successful and delightful for customers, there needs to be this input of user research or user insight. But the disconnect between when we learn about this or when we learn in the process of designing and how that actually informs iterative design is usually where there's a gap. So if you think about like very generic, right? Across the spectrum, we have design, development, and release. It's pretty broadly applicable across the workflow, but generally that's how things start. You move from design and ideation, and of course those like double diamond, going into development, handing off to engineering, and then going through the release. Typically, in the way that product works formally, is through this learning that occurs after release. So as you can see, usually there's not much learning that happens in the previous phases. It's all kind of waiting until it's released into the hands of users at the end, and that's where we end up getting our insights. This is really costly. It takes a lot of time, and it means oftentimes that we can't be iterative in design because it's already shipped. So now it's going to become some sort of like either engineering or design backlog, or worse, not going to happen at all. So when you're thinking about like user research, it's not relying on after it's shipped to be able to learn, although that is definitely a part of the process. We don't want to cap our learning to not include things that happen after we've released our products. But user research really, as defined by Jacob Nielsen and Don Norman, is really about being able to inform every part of the process, from strategizing, like that big upfront discovery level work, all the way through the assessment of actually putting a solution inside the hands of users to be able to see how that performs. There's a varying degree of the types of research, the methodologies, the techniques that can occur, but ultimately it should happen at every stage of the process. So this is a really fun tweet. I'm sure maybe some of you have seen this before. I think it just encapsulates everything that we're talking about here, where if we don't do any research, and even some of the lean methods that I'm going to show you today, we could end up in this type of scenario where we design either based on our assumptions or based on what we think from users without any kind of validation, which, as I mentioned, can be very costly and time consuming. So in my opinion, truly effective research is driven by unrelenting curiosity. And I don't think that that should come as a surprise to you, especially as designers, because we are naturally curious beings. We're very curious about the ways in which we can solve problems. We're curious about the people that we're actually solving these problems for. So really, this is just giving you the tools to be able to foster more of this curiosity throughout your process, instead of relying only on potentially user researchers to feed you these insights, or again, worse, not having any insights at all. So when I think about research in the terms of like actual design work, right? Not necessarily as a specialist providing lots of different types of research, but in the terms of what you can do as a designer, you should think about how research matches the way that you build products, how you design products, how you go to market, how you create campaigns or even produce content. It doesn't have to just be focused on even product designers or UX designers. We could be talking about brand or folks in marketing. All of these things are informed and are more successful when we have this removal of guesswork, which is ultimately what research is at the end of the day. So it creates more of those informed decisions and therefore more successful products. So let's get into the actual methodology. Now that we kind of have an understanding of why we should care, let's look at some of the different methods that we can lean on when doing product research. So I think it's important to note first, and this is not my schema here. This is from Nielsen Norman Group, which comes up quite a bit in this presentation. But there's ultimately different phases of research. And I think this is one of the reasons why it's difficult, especially for newer designers, to be able to put their finger on how to be able to best do user research or be a little bit more self-driven or independent within their research endeavors, because there's kind of a lot of dimensions to research. And this is where you might also find a lot of different types of terms being utilized. So discovery or discover types of research that are way up front in the process versus the exploratory ideas and research where you might have the starting ground of whittling something to a solution, but maybe have a variety of things that you're still exploring. Testing is really starting to put those things into practice. So when you've got a solution that can be testable, that's where that testing phase comes through. And then the listening phase is really post-release. So the learning and insight and the listening happens every step of the way, but it's kind of truncated into these different elements based on where you are in the process. And user researchers that are specialized in this work can help illuminate a lot more of this. But I think it helps us get an understanding of where some of the swim lanes are between user researchers and designers. A lot of times user researchers are going to be more focused on the big upfront strategic level, like maybe even market research or R&D types of research. They're doing a lot of the generative types of insights to be able to fuel the business by innovation and really discover new opportunities. Whereas designers, it's not to say that they wouldn't necessarily be doing that, but we're a little bit more micro in focus. We're looking at things that are more from the solution-based aspect, and we're looking at things in more of a testable of ideas, whether that's testing our concepts or testing our actual flows or wireframes. It might even be testing like the name of something or the preference or the sentiment around pricing or a brand. So these are the different phases, and within these phases, there's a whole bunch of different methods. This particular map doesn't give you all of them. It definitely gives you a lot of them, and primarily ones that are going to be much more in line with designers. It's not to say that researchers won't do this too, but I think that there's an opportunity for researchers to, as I mentioned, be a little bit more strategic in the methods that they utilize and open up a lot more of that strategic insight versus designers being able to do some of these more lean and tactical methods to really drive home some of the insights around their actual designs. So we're going to reference this quite a bit. You'll see in each one of the methods that we're going to come through, it'll actually give you an idea of what these dimensions are. So the first x-axis is between qualitative and quantitative. So qualitative insights are more about the why and how of something, versus quantitative is much more around the actual statistical information. So how much is the quantifying of something, how much or how many. So this is really in terms of the types of data or the types of insights that we get when we do research. And it's not a hard and fast. Sometimes certain methods will actually reveal qualitative and quantitative types of insight. But these types of research insights are really good to uncover, kind of what type of lane are you going in with your project or your product? Are we looking from a research perspective where we really need to understand the why and how of something, or are we looking at more of the quantity and the validation of something through those metrics? Now, the y-axis is between behavioral and attitudinal, which is a funny word. Behavioral is about what people actually do, and attitudinal is about what people say. And that's really, really important because, and then, again, this could be its own separate talk, but there is a very big difference between what people do and what they say. So it's really, and you'll see, again, in these methods where these boil down to being which type of data insights they'll actually generate. but it's helpful to be able to have this mixed method collection or the mixed insights, because you have to be able to pair these things, not overly rely on just one form of insight. And there's actually a third dimension to this. It wasn't on the original map, but there's also generative and evaluative research. And generative, as I described kind of in the phases, right, are more about like forming the idea. This is why a lot of UX researchers are focused on generative research, because they're forming hypotheses, they're forming impressions and ideas about different opportunities. It's really that big capture up front versus evaluative, which is more around the actual refinement of something. So that's why designers are oftentimes more focused on the evaluative qualities versus specialist researchers that are more oftentimes in generative. That's not a hard and fast rule. There's so much variability in that depending upon your team and company and product. But generally, this is how you can kind of think about the difference between the types of research that you might do versus the types of research that a UX researcher might do. All right, so let's get into the methods. This is where we're gonna go a little fast. You're gonna see 10 of them. So the first one is a field study. Now, field study is actually kind of just a broader category of research. It's its own, but it also kind of encompasses a few different types within it. So what is a field study? This is where you actually observe people within their own natural environment. And this is probably a good place to tell you that each one of these slides is going to incorporate a GIF to help you try to recall the method to the GIF, right? So the really key aspect of this is that in field studies, its aim is to understand and observe what people are doing in their natural environment. So it's not actually about asking them questions or bringing them to, either inside your office or even potentially finding them out in the wild somewhere else. It's about them in their natural ecosystem. So what can you learn, or what does it expose? Ultimately, it's about how the users do something and why, and it might be able to uncover different types of user needs, which generally relate to discovery opportunities. So you're going to pick up on some of these insights that you may not have even planned for, or maybe wasn't even in the project plan to uncover, but because you're in that natural environment, you're able to kind of break the lenses, right? Expose so many different variables across what that user is doing inside that context. So this is definitely more of a generative and qualitative type of method, and it's really focused around the behavior that's occurring. The next one is contextual inquiry. Now, this one's very similar to field studies. It's actually kind of a type of field study. I chose this GIF of Julia Childs because I think it encapsulates exactly what the difference is here. The difference between a field study and contextual inquiry is that field studies are really about observing from afar and not asking questions, versus contextual inquiry is still within that user's natural environment, but it has an inquiry-based process. So there are questions that are coming through. So if you think about like a cooking show, right? There's typically like a process that's unveiled. The chef is telling you about what they're doing, talking about what tools they're using. They're in their natural environment. They're incorporating the different types of maybe equipment that they use. So you're really able to uncover what are the user tasks or problems that occur, and maybe what are some of these scenario dependent insights. And again, because you have that opportunity to be able to ask questions, it gives you a little bit more of that attitudinal and behavioral information as a kind of a pairing, because you're able to ask from what you're observing. And I thought I would just bring in a quote in some of these, because again, some of these methods might be very dependent upon the type of industry you're in. Hardware, software and hardware, different types, B2C, B2B. But Uber research here talks about, being able to utilize field research. And if you think about this makes total sense, right? Being able to understand the user from the perspective of a rider or the perspective of the driver, and what that's like actually in that context and setting. Next one is interviews. So what's the difference between contextual inquiry and interviews? Well, the interviews are really more one-on-one sessions that are about what the user thinks. And there's really a wide variety of different types of interviews. So there can be unmoderated interviews, which does not have a researcher or designer present. This is taken almost like by virtue of like surveys, which we're going to see in a moment as well, versus moderated sessions. So in this context, what I'm talking about are moderated interviews where we have a one-on-one session, a user and a designer or a researcher, and they're able to extract sentiment insights. So how they feel about things, what are their motivations? There's usually a very specific goal in mind here with an interview. You're trying to uncover specific scenario-based or goal-based insights. So the interview is very focused in scope. These are usually like generative and qualitative insights. And one of the main challenges with interviews is that it's very difficult to do this at scale. So for pairing this with quantitative types of research methods, you get kind of a more holistic view of everything together. Next is surveys. It makes a lot of sense coming after interviews. As I mentioned, the difference between interviews and surveys is really this is one to many. So these are questionnaires that contain a set of questions, typically very similar in fashion to interviews. They're kind of honed on a particular problem, and they're probing for more information around those specific learning objectives. Oftentimes they uncover opinions and preferences of people. This is like where you're getting, again, that sentiment type of information, and even satisfaction levels. So if you think about like NPS, for example, NPS is a form of a survey. So it's a set of questions really to that targeted group of users to be able to probe for those attitudes. And the thing about surveys that are nice is that you can quantify this information. So you can pull qualitative insights out, but you also can extract quantitative level of information because of the sheer volume that you can produce by surveys versus those one-on-one interviews. The hard thing is being able to ask those questions. And as I mentioned, I'm not going to go too far deep into this, but a really important aspect to hone when you're creating these surveys is how to be able to ask non-leading questions. What's the difference between open-ended questions versus closed-ended questions, and so forth. So being able to dive into that more deeply will really help set your survey up for success. Next one is diary study. So diary studies oftentimes are done by specialized UX researchers. So this might be an opportunity for you to tap on the shoulder of a specialized UX researcher on your team, or maybe be a tag along to the information that comes out of diary studies. It's not something like focus groups that we see too often, or it might be best suited in particular situations. But diary studies are really the longitudinal research method that you can use to uncover user behaviors, activities, and experiences that, key point here, take place over an extended period of time. So a really great example is actually a personal example that I have. Most people in my family, as well as myself, suffer from pretty severe migraines. And when I was a kid, I had this Palm Pilot that would ring every night at 6 o'clock, and it would prompt me through various questions, and I would have to respond to the questions, right? And this was tracking information over, I think, like 6 weeks or 8 weeks. That was a diary study. It was a medical one, but it was getting these insights in the moment and basically looking for the patterns of what happened. So it's giving the user the opportunity to give an account of their experience. So it's really great for being able to triangulate those long-term behaviors. And these are, again, more generative and qualitative, but are focused more on the behavioral aspect and less of the attitudinal. Usability testing. This is one of my favorites. Obviously, being part of Maze, this is one of the core components of what Maze offers. But usability testing is a research method for evaluating your product when, based on where people are able to complete a set of tasks. It's very task oriented. So if you're familiar with like the happy path or the ultimate path, or being able to call out those user flows, this is where we're being able to understand the level of accessibility within our design solutions, the level of intuitiveness, how successful ultimately is the design. Is there a lot of confusion? So it's really going to uncover a lot of those usability issues and specifically uncover potential areas of improvement. So lots of other things can be incorporated in usability testing, right? Heat maps. You can incorporate usability testing in a moderated fashion and an unmoderated fashion, but usability testing really should be a core component of UX designer or product designer's role. It's really, really important to not have our designs be either uninformed by research or untested, or worse, both. So you can see here that this will uncover a lot of evaluative information. different than that generative insight. You can get qualitative and quantitative information, but usability testing, especially in an unmoderated capacity, is usually helpful in quantitative scenarios. And it's really about behaviors. It's all about what they're doing. Now, the short sight of usability testing, and again, when we talk about mixed methods, being able to bring in more than one, is because we can't just rely on what happened. We have to be able to understand the why behind it. So an aspect to consider when you're doing usability tests. Next one is 5-second tests. You might have heard of this one. This is a popular thing that was going around the internet. It makes me sound old, but whatever this whole sheet thing is with dogs. But it's very similar to that, right? It's ultimately where participants are shown an image. It's for 5 seconds, and then they're asked a follow-up question based on what they saw. So really open-ended. This could be incorporative of like a logo, or maybe it's the color palette, or maybe it's just a screenshot of a wireframe. Ultimately, what you're looking for here is first impressions. So very quick first impressions. And it's a recall for the clarity or the emphasis of the information. Like if you're asking for if they were able to spot a particular component, is it very findable if they weren't able to identify that within a quick 5-second scan? So this is really a generative form of UX testing. It gives you more of that quantitative information, and it's more so based on attitudinal info. So gauging really their impressions, as I mentioned. Think alouds. This is really great to couple with usability tests. So think alouds are great because this is, again, task oriented, but it's where users are going to verbalize their thinking and actions out loud. So it can be a little stumbly for users to get in the habit of, because you have to literally explain everything that you're doing. You want to really encourage them to just have a stream of consciousness. And this is where you'll be able to uncover things like their expectations, where they might look or travel to, or where they're trying to find something and they might be having some trouble. And also the natural language that people use, right? How do they describe things? How do they describe what they're trying to accomplish? It's really helpful to get kind of in the mind of the user as they're going through the process. So it kind of gives a boost to your usability studies if you can combine them. And this can really be generative insights as well as evaluative insights. It's kind of one of those interesting ones that can be applied in a lot of different measures, but they are more qualitative-based insights and very focused on behavioral. Card sorts. This is another really fun one. Card sorting is a UX research method that uses the organization of topics as cards. So you might have seen these. This is why we always get those stereotypes with designers, is like, being constantly, well, I mean, I have some sticky notes behind me, as you can see, but using sticky notes and index cards and things like that to be able to have people actually sort information that makes sense to them. So this is a research activity that's really important when you're trying to create intuitive information architecture. So it's really linked to the organization of information, usually for websites, but definitely can be used beyond that. So, yeah, you'll uncover, how people naturally categorize information, how they understand what kind of fits together. And it's usually in the form of those generative insights. So it can be used as a validation method based on something that you already have kind of constructed, identifying opportunities where your current information architecture maybe needs some improvement, but oftentimes in the generative aspect where it's before you're actually doing any of that information architecture, and you can start to frame this around the generative insights that you've uncovered. These are typically qualitative-based insights as well, and again, are more focused on behaviors. They're focused on behaviors because it's based on how they're actually sorting this information, not around their attitudes of how they would sort the information. So this is another just quick quote from a Maze customer. I'm just talking about card sorting as a technique and exercise. And it really, if you've heard anything about mental models, this is really key to mental models. So the same thing with some of the other methods, but it's trying to understand the logic and the process of which users think about certain information. How do they actually group them together? It's all based around mental models for that. This is a very funny GIF. Didn't watch this show much as a kid, but I do remember it being on. I think my parents watched it, but that might be dating myself. The reason I chose it is because I think we oftentimes as designers just get right into solutioning, and we really should pause and take a moment to deploy any of these methods, honestly. But in the sense of tree testing, this is where you're able to really understand the site structure by that findability of topics. So it's very similar to card sorts, and there's a variety of card sort activities, right? There's many different forms of card sorts. But with tree testing, you're really looking to see if the information is actually findable, not necessarily how they would sort this information, but how they would go about finding it. So if you think about tree tests, it's really like that site architecture. If you go down to a lot of websites in the very bottom of the footer, you can find that sitemap. This is basically what that is. How to be able to create that sitemap is really all around being able to conduct tree testing. So this is again going to be more of an evaluative method. Typically is more of a quantitative method because you're usually looking at this in a volume of data, but also you can see very clearly between the information of what users did or didn't do. So you can start to triangulate that a little bit different than you could with qualitative insights. All right, this is the last one, desk research, and I don't think really considered a formal UX research method, but it's one of my favorites. And the reason is because it is green pastures usually. It really will depend upon what size of organization you're in, what kind of team structure you're in, what kind of insights you can have access to, or how the company organizes that information. But there is some level of information within every single team, whether it's small, few far between, or a sea of data that's really difficult to uncover. That's a different aspect, but the information exists. And so ultimately what this is saying is not about conducting the research yourself, but utilizing secondary information that other UX researchers or maybe past designers or even support tickets, insights from sales, all of that information to be able to do your due diligence up front. So start to inform the solutioning as you move forward, or being able to validate certain insights. And then also being able to compare this information, draw patterns from this based on what you did. Is there former information that this validates or invalidates? So there's a lot to be said about desk research, but as you can see here with all of the purple dots, it really is kind of a scenario dependent type of method. So you could glean generative or evaluative research insights, qualitative or quantitative, so on and so forth. But it's a really, I think, overlooked one, and kind of goes hand in hand with some of the best practices that I'm going to talk about as to where you can start to look for these insights. So let's get into leverage. This is an aspect of it, right? We're talking about the things that are at your disposal, but it's done for a reason. It's not just research for research's sake. Leveraging research kind of comes in a couple of different colors. There's leveraging the actual insights that you glean from doing it. And then there's actually leveraging doing it at all. And I would say that's more around the advocating for product research. So as designers, we have to champion for these things. Oftentimes we're talking to individuals or stakeholders that are not designers or product researchers themselves. It's not necessarily always by malice that they don't agree with you. A lot of design sometimes can be formulated in opinion or subjective, and we really need to be able to sell internally, not just within our immediate teams, but across the organization, why the bigger picture matters. And it ultimately influences the way that we design and build, point blank, right? Our jobs as designers is to get to the best solution possible in the quickest way. And the only way that we can do that is to ensure that there are user insights that are informing that process. So being able to leverage this means that you can make the product research process more of a team sport. You don't have to have it all siloed and on the shoulders of just UX researchers. We can actually collect a lot of these insights as a team. So start looking at this as more of a collaborative process and something that the entire team can be part of in certain ways and scenarios. It also helps to democratize the data. So we'll talk about best practices in just a second around actually how to do that. But if you're doing this, even if you're of a team of one, don't have the information just living with you. Share it externally, outside of your team, outside of your immediate instance there. This is going to be really helpful, and you never know where that information is going to help kind of generate a new idea or a new endeavor. And then it also builds institutional knowledge. So when you're really advocating for research, you're also advocating for building this ongoing information as a company, which is really important, because a company that learns about their users are able to make more user-centric products. And one that learns over time helps to be able to understand this institutional knowledge from the bigger picture, right? They have a lot of insights that they can draw on. So some best practices in regards to actually leveraging this. Understand how the decisions are actually made. So this can apply to really anything. If you're trying to advocate for something, or most specifically in this instance where you're trying to advocate for doing product research, understand how the decisions are made in your team or across your company. If you know how they're made, then you can reverse engineer how to be able to get that approval or start working on that product research, because it actually maps to how the decision is being made, right? So if you can uncover that that's going to help make you make better informed decisions, but you know how those decisions are made today, you might be able to spot opportunities or gaps where user research or user insights aren't part of the decision-making process today. Just as designers that have come before us and is still part of our work today, we have to still champion and kind of sell the value of design having a seat at the table. It's the same thing with research. So you really have to kind of be an evangelist inside of your team, even if it's just you. Be the go-to person that just can't stop talking about product research. And as you start to build this as a habit and people start to notice that this is part of your process and the design decisions that you're making are stronger because of it, it's going to have ripple out effects. As I mentioned before, engage the entire team. It does not have to be just a user researcher doing all of this on their own. You shouldn't have to tap a user researcher on the shoulder in order to do a usability study. You should be able to work in tandem with other members of your team. But I want to look at even beyond just the product team. Engaging the entire team means you can incorporate insights and resources from totally different teams. Support and sales are huge insight drivers. They are literally the front lines of our customer experience every single day. They are talking to customers every day. So engage them. If it's my best go-to tip for if you're totally strapped on time, budget, or the resources to be able to do product research, go start figuring out who your allies are in sales and on support, and start to figure out what some of those things are from them. You might be even able to ask them to ask certain questions in their next maybe sales call, right? You never know what that collaboration could uncover. As I mentioned, use design to persuade stakeholders. I think we've all experienced this before, where we're really passionate and want to champion a particular design that we've created because we know that it's going to make a sizable difference to the user. And there might be a stakeholder that doesn't believe in that or has, a different opinion. Use research and the design solutions that you've created because of it to actually persuade stakeholders. It's not just happening for you to create that design solution. It's there to be able to help convince the other people as well. So don't fret on just doing this in kind of your own process. Really help to sell the design solutions that you're creating through the actual research and data that you're collecting. And the last best practice that I would say is start to think about this on a company's learning muscle, right? This is probably going to be a little bit fumbly for you in the beginning if you've never done it before. It might be feeling a little bit siloed if you're the only person that's advocating across your team for this. But learning as a company is what we believe at Maze is going to actually create better innovative products of the future. It's not going to be just about the design alone. It has to be informed by users. So building this learning muscle as a company, as a team, will even help you be able to stand out as an individual that really helps push the company, drives business impact. So there are a variety of ways that you can help build this learning muscle, and I'm happy to give insights as to how I've done that in previous scenarios as well. So I'll leave you with a couple of things here. One of these quotes really stands out to me by the president of Deloitte, and this I think really nails home what we're talking about here today. Like the single biggest driver of business impact and ultimately design, leading business impact, is through the learning opportunities that are created in organizations. And this might also be a helpful quote to help you kind of measure where is the design or UX maturity inside of your team or company. Not to shame you of where you are, but it gives you a good baseline of being able to say we're a really strong organizational learning culture and environment, or we have some steps to take to get there. And one of the other things that I wanted to make mention of here as we're rounding out our session, we're going to get to the Q&A in a moment. ADPList actually just launched their product research learning module. So if you are interested in this topic, you want to learn more about it, you can actually go into your profile settings and be able to select product research. So I'm sure there will be more information about that coming. Now, I'm a big fan of stating where all of my learning and information comes from. So these are just a couple of sources, but also really great sources to have. Just Enough Research by Erica Hall, hands down. I literally read that once a year. It is a really great, super easy, digestible read, and it will illuminate and go further than what I've spoken about today. Also, if you've never heard of Nielsen Norman Group, a lot of the information that I've shared today has come from them. So definitely check out their articles. It's a great kind of benchmark in the industry to help formulate a lot of this practice. A couple of Maze resources that I wanted to equip you with. This is kind of my design advocate resource pack here. We talked about really what I hope is a theme throughout this. All research really is around being able to understand questions, how to ask good questions, and how to be able to learn from those questions. So one of the big hurdles for a lot of designers, even specialist UX researchers, is being able to help understand how to formulate those questions. So a great resource that I actually created. So I'm pretty stoked on it. It's called the Maze Question Bank, and it's equipped with over 400 product research questions that you can use within your surveys and usability tests for a lot of different types of methodologies that we've talked about today. So it's a great resource if you want to check that out. And also the Maze guides. A lot of this information can also be found in the Maze guides. One in particular is in regards to getting started with user research. So these are really comprehensive and could be great assets for you. All right, thank you so very much. I really appreciate your time and attention. I hope that this was informative and helps to kind of jumpstart some of your thinking around user research and how that is applied as a designer. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and we've got about the last 10 minutes or so for questions. Okay, I'm going to scroll over here to Slack, and I've got Carolina, who has lovingly selected some questions for us today that haven't already been answered in the chat. So first question is from Darcy. Darcy asks, and says, this is a great presentation. Thank you so much, Darcy. Does anyone else sometimes feel like this should be presented to upper management, project management? Maybe that's a question more so for the group here, but I'll just give my 2 cents because I see it. Yeah, absolutely. Stakeholders need to be involved in this kind of learning opportunities as well. I do this all the time. I will send my my manager links to things that I think are super compelling or around the topic that we've been recently discussing. I think this probably has its own caveats based on the nature of your relationship and other factors at play. But don't be afraid to send them your thoughts. You're hired for your point of view and your ongoing expertise. So share it. Another question here is from Rosie. Can we achieve desk research by taking advantage of information that we get from stakeholder interviews? Yes, absolutely. Stakeholder interviews are a part of desk research or secondary research. And so it's even a great opportunity, right? Because stakeholders are a little bit biased in the sense that, they're internally involved. So it takes on its own flavor of the types of insights that you can garner, but they're really, really impactful. First of all, it gives you great alignment and assures that you're kind of, what the ultimate goal is and the refinement of the question. But it also gives you really great inkling as to what they care about. So use your design skills and your research techniques on your stakeholders for sure. Next question is from Diana. Diana asks, as a designer, after you've had the acceptance from stakeholders, how would you manage inserting a test as a process inside an agile sprint? Awesome. Okay. Yes, this is oftentimes a misconception that because I think we're still dealing with like layover legacy ideology from waterfall, right? Where we have like these very siloed processes of the workflow, and then it's usually still predicated around shipping it and learning. And so that kind of old guard mentality is still pervasive, and it is kind of the antithesis to doing research in an agile or lean way. Because it thinks about research as like these big project endeavors that happen at very particular points in the process, and usually is, more about what happens after it's already released. So if you're in an agile environment and you're trying to advocate for product research to take place, utilize some of the tools that are at your disposal. Maze is certainly a great one to be able to show how different research can really be when it is done at scale and in a quick environment. Maybe try to underscore some of those things around it not taking in a huge amount of the timeline. I think really there's a lot of great resources about being able to do this in an agile environment, but I think being able to reinforce that, like I mentioned, every design step should really be considered a testable point in the process. So what is it there, even in a small fashion, or what kind of like usability can we do in a quick fashion that can just inform where we are currently, instead of having it be kind of this huge, enormous endeavor that might be more of an overview outlook of it. So I hope that helps. Maybe just try to break it down into smaller pieces. And I think that people will naturally see how this can fit in a lot more easily than I think what is previously in their mind, maybe from waterfall. All right, keeping rolling with the questions here. Let's see, this one is from, and apologies if I mispronounce your name, I think it's Helena. What would you recommend when stakeholders are pushing back on suggestions for user research and testing, but asking for quick top-line changes? Kind of hard to do if they don't understand UX, right? So I think if I understand this question, it's how to be able to maybe advocate for an alternative than what the stakeholder is advising. So I'll give you an example. I am actually embedded on the marketing team. So, everyone at Maze is fairly aware of product research and UX design because of the industry, obviously, that we're in. But the folks that are on the marketing team are marketers. That's why they're hired, for that specialty skill set. And so I'm one of the only designers that are embedded in the marketing team. And I've had to do this as well, where I've had to advocate for what may seem to someone who's not a designer as a really minor or maybe even arbitrary argument, or goes against what that person believes should be there. And so the way in which, again, that I've done this is, first of all, understanding who I'm talking to. And that helps to uncover like what their point of view is. So if I'm speaking to someone from more of a like copy perspective, that's a little bit different than speaking to someone from perhaps maybe more of a brand perspective. And when it comes to stakeholders, there might be this natural level of like fear or intimidation, because there might be, they're most likely someone that you report to. But I challenge that, and I use design and the insights that I've been able to generate from research or product research, even if it's small, to basically take it away from what I'm advocating for and instead have it step into the shoes of the user. So for example, there was a very, very small thing, but I was one of the ones that created the podcast landing page for Maze. We just released a podcast, and I did the web design for it. And one of the aspects was around like the actual like button copy, right? And I had to convey my rationale for why it was designed in that fashion with conventions that I knew about UX research. And when you make it more of a learning opportunity for that person from your area of expertise, sharing to another person in their area of expertise, you oftentimes can either find that they then understand and agree with you, or you can come to a better happy medium. So it's a very long-winded answer, but hopefully that's helpful. We've got about 5 minutes left. I'm gonna take a few more questions here. This one is from Mohammed. Seeing Maze or user testing or many other tools, what do you think about the future of digitizing usability testing or user research in general? Yeah, so if I understand this correct as well, I think this is really related to like the difference between what I think we all have in our minds around user research, which is more like in the lab, on site. That still happens, maybe not now with the pandemic as much, but that is a little bit different than like what I think Mohammed is explaining here with digital or remote usability testing, right? There's always going to be trade-offs. There is not one bulletproof method. There's not one bulletproof technique that always works. It's being able to understand what tools, or how I like to think about it, like arrows in your quiver, what is available to you and what makes the most sense given the situation or the circumstance that you're in. So with like digital remote usability testing, right? How can we utilize remote to be able to potentially get an upside of way more quantifiable information than what we could have potentially done in just a labs interview, kind of maybe bringing in 5 to 10 people? What can we accomplish by having that remote accessibility at our fingertips? And where are some of the limitations in that, right? If we know that that it's really important for us to be able to see our users in their environment, and we're doing things in a remote fashion, how can we think creatively to maybe incorporate some of those aspects? Maybe it's about doing an unmoderated test in a remote fashion to gather a lot of longitudinal information, right? And then we gather some of that more latitudinal stuff, the more deep insight that goes a little bit more like vertically, right? Inside those user interviews. Maybe it's a combination of methodology that helps us get to where we need to be instead of just relying on one thing. So I think it's just a practicality thing of thinking about like holistically, where do these methods fill in the gaps and what gaps do they leave on the table? All right, I have maybe time for one more question. Okay. This is a question. Where do I find the right people to do interviews with, or where do I find potential users, especially if the product is not really being used yet? Thanks, Zoe, for this question. So this is definitely one that comes up all the time. You can't talk about user research without talking about how to find people. I mean, first plug, I will say, keep your eye on Maze, because there's really, really, really exciting things coming in regards to that. And for some tooling, you're still able to, like inside Maze and a lot of other tools have like panels that you can, enlist to be able to incorporate, users. But I think the things that are a little bit more compelling and maybe show insights that are a little bit more specific to what you're trying to uncover is when you get creative, right? If you don't have a lot of users, you probably know people that might like work within this space or be interested in this space. You could probably post up on Twitter and find people. You could go to, tool review sites, like get creative. Where are the people that are where are people hanging out that might be interested in what you're doing? Go find those places. And I will tell you, it is a very big misconception that users don't want to give you feedback. We're not troubling them unless we're asking too much of them and not being thoughtful about it. But 99.9% of the time, users have vested interest in giving you their feedback, and they will give it to you if you ask. So I think it's more so about just being able to fine tune like what types of users make sense for the scenario that you're in. And then creatively using your design skills, resourcefulness to be able to go find the areas where those people exist. So I know we're at time. I didn't have time to take all of the questions, but I hope that was helpful. I'm really, really great to be here and to be part of kicking off this partnership with ADPList. Feel free to get in touch if this is the first time that you're doing product research, or if you have any questions, feel free to find me. I hang out most on Twitter, but yeah, feel free to follow up. I'd love to hear how this goes. Thanks, everybody. I hope you have a great rest of the day.